I have been woodworking for a little over 12 years now. It all kind of started with a table. Our dining room table was trashed and we needed to replace it, and I looked at how much is a new table and then thought, well, it can't be much more expensive to just build it myself. And so it's actually the table that is still currently sitting in my kitchen after 12 years of woodworking. I would love to redo that, but Mandy won't let me. But after I finished that table, the guy who had kind of helped me along, because I didn't know anything about woodworking, he taught me all my stuff. He said, well, if you want, you can help me with my next project. And it just kind of launched from there. And now, 12 years later, it's pretty hard to tell you exactly how many projects I have made, both big and small and everywhere in between. It's one of my favorite things in the world to do. I love getting to take something that was just an idea and turn it into a reality. I love the idea that I have furniture in my house that nobody else in the world has anything remotely close to it. And I love getting to be somebody who helps someone get the kitchen or the bathroom or the, cutting board of their dreams made. Usually that someone, though, is Mandy. Mandy loves that I do this. But sometimes she has to be a little bit more involved than she might wish to be in these projects, because sometimes things are a little easier with 4 hands than they are with 2. For instance, last year I made these bookshelves for our basement to hold our movie collection. If you don't know, I'm kind of like Blockbuster Video. If you have a movie that you want to watch, ask me. I either have it or something very close to it, so I got you. Man, I miss Blockbuster, though. But each one of these shelves is fairly tall, and that meant that the walls were going to be longer than I could handle on my own with the table saw that I currently have. I've got plans in mind right now to make an outfeed table, is what it's called. That's going to kind of help remedy that. But for now, I needed somebody to be on the other side of the table saw to catch the plywood as it was coming off there. And so Mandy got voluntold to do that for me. Now, it's important to know that at this particular point in this project, everything in my shop was chaos. I had pieces of plywood all over the place. I had pieces of random lumber just stacked all over the map. None of it was put together yet. Nothing looked like anything yet. And so Mandy comes in to help catch the larger pieces of plywood, and she's confused by what she's seeing. She kind of stops and she looks around and she goes, "What's all this for?" Now, here's the thing. My wife knows me better than anybody else in this room here, but there are still times she has no idea what's going on inside of my head. Probably for the best, because that would be scary. But I knew what everything was supposed to be. And I knew how all these pieces were going to fit. I knew when they were going to get put together. I knew all of it. And so I'm trying to explain to Mandy that even though this piece doesn't look particularly great, it's never going to be seen. It's going to be in the back. You're never going to see this thing happen before. This piece is to help support the top shelf that's going to hold all these cool movie replica things that we've got, which is, I'm a nerd. This piece is going to be this. That's all I'm trying to do is explain it all to her. And finally, after a little while of her just giving me this blank stare, she goes, "You know what? I trust that you know what you're doing." And that was the end of it. Again, I knew how all of this stuff was supposed to fit together. It's like I could see the end of it before we ever even got to that point. I knew what this piece was supposed to hold together. I knew when it was supposed to be placed in there, and I knew exactly what form and function it was going to take. Mandy didn't. She had no idea what any of this was supposed to look like. And so as she's staring out onto this chaos that she's being told is eventually going to be a really cool bookshelf, even though none of it resembled a bookshelf, she just had to trust that I knew what I was doing, and that I knew what the end result was going to be, and that all of this was going to work out the way that it was supposed to, even though none of it made sense right now. Trust is always a tricky thing for us. No matter how far along we get in our lives, trust is always something that is difficult for us to give. I don't know that I can say definitively that there is anyone I trust fully 100% without question. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of people, Mandy being at the top of that list, that I trust 99.999% of the time, but there's always that lingering voice in the back of my head that says, even though this person has shown me time after time that I can trust them, what if this time they don't show up? What if this time they're not there for me the way that they're supposed to be? What if this time they fail me? And that trust becomes difficult for us. It's difficult for us to trust anyone with just even normal everyday things. And I'm going to guess that, like me, you have learned to not trust based off of experience. That someone along the way has shown you that they weren't worthy of the trust that you gave them. And so it becomes difficult for us to trust anybody fully, especially when we talk about trusting somebody who doesn't tell us the full picture, who doesn't give us the full end result, who doesn't share with us the full scope of their plan, and yet invite us to be a part of that. It's a difficult thing for us to follow somebody and involve ourselves in whatever they're doing. And that's one of the things that makes it such a challenge for even the most experienced, even the most spiritual, even the most knowledgeable Christian out there to fully trust God. Now, I want to pause for just a quick second and do a little aside, because there are definitely some of you in this room that are going, another sermon on trusting God? Haven't we talked about this subject enough? To which my answer is, no. Because I don't think that we could ever fully talk about our need to trust God enough. Because the reality is that no matter how far along you are in your faith, whether this is your very first Sunday walking into a church or whether you have been a faithful Christian for 75 plus years of your life, you still wrestle with trust. Every single one of us do, especially when we talk about trusting God. Because like we have said time and time again, God does not deal in spoilers. He doesn't tell us how things are going to work. He doesn't tell us how our part is going to fit into his overall big plan. He doesn't even tell us how this particular thing that he's calling us to do is going to make any sense at all. He just tells us to go and do things. And that makes it difficult because sometimes the things that God calls us to do, well, they're difficult. Or they don't seem to make a whole lot of sense, or they're just seemingly silly. And since God doesn't tell us what the end result is, it makes it difficult for us to fully trust him in whatever it is that he's calling us to do. Never mind the fact that we are talking about trusting a spiritual body that we cannot see, that we cannot interact with in a normal way that I can interact with a normal human being. A normal human being breaks my trust, I can slap them. But God calls us to trust when we cannot see him. And so when we don't know the end result, and yet God calls us to do these weird or strange or unusual things to do, it's hard for us to fully give in to that, trusting completely that God knows what he's doing. And that's why I think that Gideon might be not just the most relatable character that we're going to talk about in Judges, but maybe one of the most relatable characters in all of Scripture. And Gideon, we're going to be focusing on Judges chapter 6 and 7 today. So if you want to turn there in your Bibles, you can. But let me just tell you now, Gideon's story is much longer than what we're going to be talking about today. So like I said a few weeks back when we started this whole series, go back and read this for yourself. Because Judges is so much more than we're ever going to be able to cover. We're only covering it for 2 more weeks beyond this one because, again, we said we're spending a whole year in the Old Testament, and we still don't have a king of Israel yet. So we got to move, folks. But so go ahead and read this story all on your own. We're going to be focusing on Judges chapter 6 and 7. But let me remind you that last week we got to meet some pretty interesting people. We spent some time talking about the story of Deborah and Barak. We got to meet a lovely angelic woman named Jael who drove a tent peg through a dude's head until it was pinned all the way to the ground, which is definite wife material if ever there was one. And once more, there is peace in Israel. But then, when my kids were little, they loved to watch. It was their favorite cartoon, and it made no sense to me because it's one of the oldest cartoons. They loved to watch Tom and Jerry. I don't know what it is about that cartoon cat and mouse, but my goodness, they are still entertaining. And I don't think there's been a new cartoon of them since like 1950. But my kids love to watch it, and I love to sit there and watch it with them because as a kid, I loved me some Tom and Jerry too. Every single one of us. But here's the thing, my kids have grown up in the age of streaming. I grew up in the age where you get to watch one, maybe two Tom and Jerry cartoons, and then you're done for a week. Streaming has kind of ruined Tom and Jerry for me a little bit because that particular setup of having to wait a week in between cartoons, it made it so you would be able to hide the fact that every Tom and Jerry cartoon is about 95% the same exact thing. And when you watch episode after episode after episode after episode, because it would keep them entertained for hours, it kind of ruins the formula for you. I mean, every episode is essentially the same thing. The circumstances and the stuff that's going on around them, maybe even the setting is a little bit different, but still, Tom is going to chase after Jerry, trying to eat him. Jerry is going to do everything he can to get away from Tom and oftentimes cause Tom physical harm. In hilarious means, but everybody in this room just heard Tom's yell in the back of your head because it's just ingrained in our DNA. But every single one of them was the same thing. And I would find myself after sitting down and watching 3 hours of Tom and Jerry with my daughters, wondering, is anything ever going to change? And I say that because I am at that point when it comes to the people of Israel. Because here we are, Judges chapter 6. We're only 6 chapters deep into this book. And still verse 1 is so much the same that I've decided to make things a little different for me. You're going to read the parts in yellow with me. Everybody ready? The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian this time for 7 years. Are they ever going to change? Is the formula ever going to get broken? Because at a certain point, this starts getting depressing, doesn't it? Here we are, 6 chapters deep, roughly 5 generations removed from Joshua, and we are still here. But this time they're being oppressed by the Midianites. And the Midianites might be going for the title of worst oppressors ever. What a title to have, right? See, I mean, if you thought things were bad all the way back with Eglon, our super fat king, whose the blade had to go... I love it. It's so funny. It's the best story in the Bible next to the crucifixion. Full stop. But if you thought things were bad with him, the Midianites are worse. All Eglon was looking for was for tribute. Now that tribute would probably come through heavy taxation of the Israelites, so they were being hit financially. The Midianites are actively trying, it seems, to kill the Israelites in the slowest way possible. And I say that because of what it says in verses 3 and 4. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance in Israel and no sheep or ox or donkey. They are taking away the literal food out of their mouths. That is how heavily they are oppressing the Israelites. And in fact, things are going so bad for them that people are hiding in caves and in the mountaintops just trying to find some semblance of relief from these people because things are getting so bad. And of course, it leads them to cry out to God. And it's at this point that God does something a little different. See, up till now, we read the same thing over and over again, that the Israelites fail, God sends an opposing nation to oppress them, the people cry out for deliverance, God sends a judge. This time, though, God decides to tip his hand a little bit to let them know, here's why this keeps happening to you? Because he sends a prophet who remains unnamed to us, which I found wild myself, that this prophet would come in at this point in time, and we never get the dude's name, and he only shows up to say this one thing in verses 8 through 10. It says, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel, and he said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. God is letting them know, if you want to break this cycle, just stop it. Stop chasing after these gods that aren't real. Chase after the one that you know brought you out of Egypt, rescued you from slavery, has saved you from oppression time after time after time after time. Because I'm the only God that matters to you. If you want to see this stop happening, if you want to see this cycle broken, stop it. I find it interesting that this is the point where God is starting to get a little fed up with the way that things are running here. But after this, we get a chance to meet and I'm going to use this word really loosely at the start here, our hero. And at least at first, he doesn't exactly present himself in a very heroic fashion. We find out in verse 11, now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now, to understand why this is not exactly the most heroic of introductions, you need to understand a little bit about what it meant to beat out wheat in this particular time period, and also about wine presses in this particular time period. So we're going to have a little bit of farming education. Yay! Typically in this particular time period, when you would harvest wheat, you would gather all of it together, but the wheat itself, even though it's removed from the stalk, would still be encased in what is known as the chaff. Chaff is inedible. It's not going to work out really well. Plus, I don't know if you've ever tasted it. I have. It's not good. So you need to find a way to separate the chaff from the wheat, right? And one of the easiest ways to make this happen, particularly at this time period, now we've got farming equipment that does it for you with a computer. It's pretty interesting, but it cost about $500,000. The way you would separate it was you would simply take the wheat all together and you would toss it into the air, because chaff is incredibly light. And so even the faintest breeze would help blow away the chaff, right? So that makes sense. You want the chaff gone, toss it up into the air. Wine presses in this particular time period were just giant holes in the ground, sometimes going as much as 10 to 12 feet deep. You would toss your grapes into that hole, and then later on, usually your nana would go and stomp on those grapes to make wine. You really hope that Nana washed her feet. Gideon is trying to separate wheat from the chaff by tossing it up into the air in a hole in the ground. I don't know what you know about holes in the ground. They're not exactly known for allowing a whole lot of wind in here. So I got a feeling this is going to take him a while. And we're kind of led to believe right away that the only reason why Gideon is doing this is because he's hiding. This is our hero, everybody. Hiding out, trying to hide his illegal grain in a wine press. Cool. I'm excited about this guy. The angel comes and approaches Gideon and tells him, hey, you're going to be the one to save the people from the hand of the Midianites. Gideon and him have a theological conversation where they ask probably the most important question that any of us ask. If God is real, why is he allowing the suffering of my people? Again, read Gideon's story, because dude asks some really tough questions that we're still wrestling with thousands of years later. But ultimately he gets on board, or at least he seems like he is totally on board, because one of the first things that he does is he goes and he cuts down the Asherah pole and he destroys the altar of Baal. Now an Asherah pole at this particular time would have been like a highly decorative pole. It might have been a special tree, but it was there in service to worship the fertility god of Asherah. It was a physical point that people could point to as they were worshiping Asherah, and Gideon cuts it down. He takes the altar of Baal and he destroys it. And this is Gideon really fulfilling what we talked about last week, that third element of being a judge at this particular time, that he is the spiritual mentor of these people. And this is Gideon telling the entire nation of Israel, we're doing a reset, everybody. We're getting rid of this junk. We're finally getting rid of these things. These two particular gods, Asherah and Baal, they were heavily worshipped by the Canaanites, the people who used to live in this land. Thanks again, Joshua's generation, for driving all that out. And they're supposed to get back onto serving the God of Israel. Gideon is setting a hard reset. This is a huge moment as Gideon is almost blatantly standing up to the entire nation of Israel and saying, enough. And so we would look at that moment and we think, man, this guy who at first we thought was kind of a wuss, he just did something incredibly great for God. This dude must trust God. And then you get a couple of verses down to verse 36. It says, then Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I'm laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. We're literally like the verse after he just stood up to all the nation of Israel. He just did something incredibly bold for his faith, but now, I need a little reassurance here that you're actually going to be with me. I trusted you there, but that was different. That was my family. Now you're wanting me to go up against the Midianites. I need reassurance that I can trust what you're going to do. And so Gideon goes to bed. He wakes up the next day. The whole ground is dry. The fleece is sopping wet. Cool. We can move on, right? Well, could be an anomaly. It could have just happened. So tell you what, God, tomorrow, if I wake up and the fleece is dry, but all the ground is wet, then yeah, I totally trust you then. God allowed that to happen because he woke up the next day, fleece is dry, ground is wet. Cool, now we can move on. So Gideon begins to gather up an army, and it's quite an army. He gathers about 32,000 men. That sounds impressive to us right now because we're trying to picture 32,000 men, but I can tell you this is not exactly a strong fighting force to go up against the Midianites. And I say that because we need to understand something. When we kind of get to Judges chapter 8, verse 10, we're alerted to the fact that there were 120,000 Midianite soldiers at the camp that Gideon is told, you're going to go attack them here. And Gideon's rolling up with 32,000 dudes. 32,000, 120,000. Who do you think is walking away from this fight? That's not exactly a whole lot of numbers, right? This is not the kind of way that you want to start a battle. You need to get more men, don't you? Well, not according to God. God says in Judges chapter 7, verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give to the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Okay, so here's how we're going to whittle it down. God tells him in verse 3, go stand before these grown men who are all geared up and ready for battle and say, hey, if anybody's too scared, you can go home. To a bunch of dudes. If y'all are too scared, you can go home. Yeah, nobody's going home. 22,000 went home. Good self-awareness? 22,000 left, leaving only 10,000. Our odds just went from about 4-1 to 12-1. We're going in the wrong direction as far as odds go. And now we're left with only 10,000. Okay, God says we're going to make it happen. We only got 10,000 guys. I guess we'll give it a shot. And then God speaks up again. Still too many. Huh? How many wars do you think get won when the odds are 12 against 1? Any guesses? Okay, not many of you are great history buffs. 0 is the answer, right? Nobody walks, I don't care if you are Batman. If you got 12 dudes coming after you at the same time, you're probably not walking away from this fight. And God is still saying that this is still too many. And he decides, here's how we're going to whittle things down. He says in verse 5, so he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Otherwise, or likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And he's told, just keep the guys who are lapping the water like a dog. Now, if I'm Gideon, I'm saying, hey, God, can we flip that? Because I don't want to hang out with the guys who are drinking the water like they're a dog. Those guys are weird. But he winds up, he started with 32,000 soldiers. He ends with 300. And that's it. This is the crew that God has allowed Gideon to take into this war with 120,000 trained, armed to the teeth soldiers. You got 300 dudes, and that's all you have. There is no part of this that makes any sense whatsoever, and I haven't even gotten to the plan that God has for them yet. Gideon is struggling to understand why God is making this happen. And in fact, the night before the big attack, God has a final task for Gideon. And you got to read this because I love the way that this is read. Verses 9 through 11, it says, that same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. In other words, God is saying, this is it, let's go, we're going to battle. But if you are afraid to go down, well, go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterwards your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. So go fight the battle right now, but if you're too afraid, go with Purah. Then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. Yeah, he's still afraid. I got 300 guys. We're going up against this army. I'm going to need a minute. While he's there, Gideon is given yet another word from the Lord, this time in the form of a vision. And once that vision happens, but I want to remind you, Gideon's the only one who gets told this vision. Gideon is suddenly on board. Something happens in the midst of that vision. We're not really told what the vision is, but it's enough that Gideon is finally reassured enough to know, I can trust God. But I want to remind you, Gideon is not the only guy involved here. And I'm going to guess that for those 300 other dudes, when they're kind of just given a part of the plan, all of them are thinking, we're not going home. Because all 300 guys are given a torch that they are told to keep in a clay jar in one hand. And in the other hand, they're given a trumpet. Not a sword, not a spear, a trumpet. We're going to kill them as a ska band, and it's going to be great. Oh, thank God people laughed at that. I was like, it's weird I was going to have to explain ska to everybody, but y'all are cool. I should have known. Anyway, how is this the plan? A torch kept in a clay jar and a trumpet. That's all you get to go into war with 120,000 dudes with. How is this the plan? There is no chance. I'm guessing all 300 men are saying there is no chance this is going to work. And then the three companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hand the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow, and they cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out, and fled. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth-shittah towards Zareph, as far as the border of Abel-meholah by Tabbath. There's no chance any of this plan made any sense whatsoever. It still worked. All that Gideon and subsequently his men had to go on was God simply inviting him to trust him, to know that God knows something you don't know. And it worked. Again, I doubt very sincerely that any of those 300 guys thought that this was going to work or that this was some sort of a great plan, because there's no military strategy behind it. Blow a trumpet, break a pot, light a torch. That's the plan. And you're going to win. Okay. And then it worked. Nothing about God's plan made any sense to them, and yet it still worked out. Why? Because God knew something they didn't. God had the whole thing in mind, and if he explained any part of it, I'm going to guess the guys wouldn't have shown up for it. We have this mindset that there's no way that God can make things in our lives work out until it works out. That there's no way that us going down this particular path or having to deal with this particular struggle or having to face this challenge in life is going to make our lives any better, is going to make our lives work out. And then it does. Somehow, some way, God finds a way to make things fit into his plan. The Bible tells us that God works out all things for the good of those who love him. It doesn't say that God makes everything good for those who love him. It says, I'm going to make all things work for good. That hard situation that you have to walk through that makes no sense, that person who's in your life just to seemingly make your life miserable, somehow God is going to turn all that stuff for good. And it doesn't make sense to us, and we have to struggle to trust God in the midst of that. And then somehow, some way, one day, we're faced with a realization, oh, that made sense now. This thing that was so painful, that was so difficult for me, that I didn't understand, why am I going through this? Now it makes sense to me. Some things may never fully make sense to us. I believe it's C.S. Lewis, don't quote me on that, but he has this picture of the first moment of heaven, and that moment of heaven being, when we get to see all the pieces working out and fitting together, suddenly the thing that made no sense, I'm clinging to that hope myself, because there are still things in my life that I'm waiting for the on. Still moments in my life where I don't know why I had to walk through that, but I can still say that even though I had to walk through those moments, they've led to some really good things in my life. I don't know why God had my very close friend pass away from a heart attack in her sleep at 43 years old. But I know that it's led me to being more careful about my own heart and pushing others to make sure you check some stuff out. I don't know why my parents had to get divorced after 37 years of marriage and put me in the middle of all their arguing. But man, it's given me a whole other perspective on people who have to walk through that. And it's been able to help me relate to people more in that. I don't know why some of these things happen. They don't make a whole lot of sense to me. But God still manages to use it for my good. Now, does that minimize the pain? No. Please don't ever think that it minimizes the very real pain that you are feeling. But you want to know how I know I can trust God for myself? Because I'm still here. Because even though I walked through those moments, even though I've walked through that pain in my life, I'm still standing. Like Sue said during our worship today, even though we walked through the midst of that, I'm still able to sing, God, you are so good. I don't understand a lot of God's plan, I don't get why certain things are allowed to happen or why certain people have to be the way that they are. It doesn't make any sense to me until it works. Until it all fits together, until it all happens. And yet, so many times in our walk with God, we still resist over and over again. God, who has shown himself that you can trust me over and over again, not just in our lives, but in the lives of the people in Scripture, like Gideon. God has shown I am worthy of that trust, and yet we still resist. We'll still say things like, well, I don't know enough, or I don't think I'm ready for this right now. When God called Gideon, dude was trying to separate chaff from wheat in a hole in the ground. Do you think he felt ready? Do you think he felt like, oh, I know enough? And God didn't tell him the full plan. Gideon struggled with trust every single step of the way. All of it. God, I know you called me to do this, but I'm not going to do it unless the fleece is wet. Oh, okay, the fleece is wet. I'm not going to do it unless the fleece is dry. What now? God, I'm not going to do this unless you can show me what you're going to do. God, I'm not going to do this. You want me to go attack now? I'm going to wait, and I'm going to go with Purah, like you said. Every step of the way, Gideon struggled to trust God, but God still used him. He struggled to trust time after time, and God still used him. Because God is big enough, his love for us is great enough that he can still find use of us in spite of our distrust. Again, whether you've been a Christian for a day or a million days, you still wrestle with trust. But can I give you the reassurance that God is big enough and his love is big enough to still use you in spite of that? That is the beauty of the God that we serve, is that even though we may question every single step along the way, God's still taking us there. Sometimes kicking and screaming, but he's still taking us there because we can trust him. Doubt is an understandable thing. I would even go so far as to say it is a natural thing. Again, we're talking about a being that we cannot see, and so doubt in our faith is naturally going to occur. But it can, and please hear me when I say this, it can be overcome. Sometimes our prayer just needs to resemble the same as the man in Mark chapter 9, verses 23 and 24, and we'll close with it. Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe. Help my unbelief."